I hope the last video has been a truly confusing part of your journey to scoring high on PTE, because guess what? It will only get more confusing from now on. And this is just the very first episode actually talking about the questions. Ready to have fun? I got my scores, so it's definitely going to be fun for me to watch you guys suffer. Please like, subscribe, and share. So read aloud. This is probably the most fundamental question type of the entire speaking section. Here is what your interface looks like during the actual test. Hint hint, the interface is really bland that all questions basically look the same. But what do you expect from an institute that gives you reusable booklets and markers instead of actual writing tools? Here are the requirements. You will be shown a passage, typically a paragraph with about 60 words. You'll usually be given 40 seconds to go through it, and then 40 seconds to read it aloud afterwards. Sometimes the reading and speaking times can be a bit shorter if the passage itself is quite short, but going with 40 seconds is a very safe bet. You will end up with 6 to 7 questions for read aloud each test. Alright, that'll be all for now. Have a good one. Talk to you later. Wait, you want more info? How difficult can it be to read something out loud? Fine. Let's go through the details and some of the common struggles that students experience. First of all, read aloud affects the reading score, which makes no sense because it doesn't require any comprehension of the passage. Always bear in mind that you will be scored on pronunciation and oral fluency. This is a big chunk of your score. As for content, actually, we don't know how much the content is worth. Why, Pearson? Why do you disclose the value of content for every other question but not this one? This seems like such a trivial detail for you to leave out. Whatever, man, you do you. For this specific question type, content is scored based on the words you say. If you go through the entire text without any mistakes, you will get a full score on content. A mistake in this context means omitting, adding, or replacing words from the text. Agencies tend to scold students when they make a mistake during speaking, not for the mistake per se, but for them going back and trying to correct themselves. This has some logic behind it, because if you repeat yourself just to say something better, there is a possibility that you will lose points not only for content, but for fluency as well. Remember that repetition is a punishable mistake, so it is better for students to just keep on going. My opinion would be that most students shouldn't be making those mistakes in the first place. If you do, it usually means you need more practice before donating your money to the multinational corporation. You could have paid me for a few hours of private sessions, for example. Because of the fact that you have exactly the same amount of time for preparation and answering, I would recommend you take this opportunity and read the passage once before the mic begins recording. It gives you a good sense of how fast your speech can be and what difficult parts there are in the text. Just don't raise your voice or you will become the worst human being that ever lived on this planet. Let somebody else be that scumbag. I always recommend students to spend the initial 40 seconds of reading time to do two very important things. The first one is looking for words that you might find difficult to pronounce, either because they're long or they consist of certain sounds that you know you have difficulty to get right, like the TH and whatnot. Sometimes there can even be, say, names or places or other stuffs that are downright not English. That ought to be fun. You should be looking for words that you find difficult to pronounce, not the ones that you don't know the meaning of. There is a big distinction. You don't need to know what a word means to get the pronunciation right, and you can certainly butcher the pronunciation of the words you know. In fact, there is a very dangerous middle ground that a student might think they know how to pronounce a word, usually because it's a simple one, but then make some huge mistake. This is the worst case scenario because unknowingly making a mistake means it is very difficult for a student to fix it by themselves. That's why I'm here. Send me your recordings and I'll pick some to comment on to point out potential problem areas that you should consider fixing. Email down in the description below. I'll give you a quick example. Many students don't know the difference between ear and year. Most Chinese students in fact pronounce both as a letter, which is year. This is pretty bad because in this case, the machine will almost certainly recognize your speech as an entirely different word, and it's going to cost you in terms of content and pronunciation. Later on, you'll recognize a pattern. It's usually the simple words that students might mess up, partially because of students' blind confidence, partially because more complicated words actually obey the rules of pronunciation better than the simpler ones. The second thing a student will want to do before they contribute to noise pollution
Just call me angel of the morning, angel.
is to look for pauses in the text. Chances are most students can finish the entire passage without breathing somewhere in the middle unless you're a scuba diver, but even then, you're not supposed to finish everything in one go. There are natural pauses in a fluent speech, and they're not to be ignored. Let's quickly go through some of the rules you will have to follow when looking for pauses. The first one is to pause at punctuations, which is obvious when I point it out, but students constantly fail to oblige.
It goes on and on and on and on and on and on.
You have no idea how common this mistake actually is. It's very simple. Whenever you see something that's not a word, take a break. Of course, how long the breaks should be depend on what punctuation you run into. Generally speaking, you pause longer for a period than for a comma. That's one very simple rule to follow, and usually you treat colons, semicolons, question marks, and exclamation marks just like a period in terms of pausing if you see any. The second part of the rule is a bit more complicated. You should always pause at commas, and they tend to be shorter than a full stop. But commas differentiate among themselves. Some commas should pause longer than others, and that completely depends on what the comma is used for. If the comma is used for parallelism, they tend to be shorter. If the comma is used for a compound or complex sentence, they should be slightly longer, but still shorter than a full stop. Here is an example to help illustrate this rule. While I hate seafood in general, I do enjoy salmon, tuna, and cod, but only in specific dishes. The first and last commas are used to separate grand structures of a sentence, so they should be given more pause. The middle two are only used to parallelize the three kinds of fish, so they are shorter. That covers the first rule, how to pause with punctuations.
The best.
Now, what about the longer sentences without a punctuation somewhere in the middle?
I know.
Then recognition of different parts of speech would be very helpful.
They are monsters.
In short, you should look for prepositions, conjunctions, and leads of a clause, like an adverb or a pronoun.
What?
These generally signify where the sentence branches out in terms of structure, so they are the natural stopping points. Another rule I like to quickly mention right now is pausing when the subject-predicate-object continuum is broken down with something jammed in the middle. If you don't know what a subject, predicate, or object is, I won't delve into that right now, but it should be one of the first structural concepts you learn in English. If you didn't, file a lawsuit against your school. Anyway, if any of those three components are separate from each other because you have a preposition or clause somewhere in between, it's usually a good place to pause. Here is a sample question chosen from the official offline practice test that you can download from the official website. The very first sentence is easy. You pause at the comma and at the period. Starting the second sentence, you pause at the first comma and then you run into a wall of text. Whenever you see a continuous piece of text this long, it usually means there are somewhere to pause in the middle. The pausing place is right in front of continue. Plants is the subject of the sentence and continue the predicate. They have a relative clause right in between, so that's where the pause should be. The next two commas should be relatively short because they parallelize simple phrases, unlike the next comma, which should be paused longer since it leads to a full clause. Then you have the period, which should be a piece of cake for you guys. The last sentence is also quite long, and this time the two that's tell you where the pauses should be. By now, you should have a few questions regarding how I come up with the pauses. The first question will probably be why I pause at certain locations but not others, like I haven't paused once at a preposition. There are a few caveats to that rule. The first is that prepositions tend to have a lower priority than pronouns, adverbs, and conjunctions because these are generally used for a clause. Another reason is that prepositions might be used to aid an intransitive verb or is included as part of the verb phrase. Here is an example. My friends and I came up with this brilliant idea to play Dota together. Friend is a strong word. They're just people I went to school with. They're all dead to me. If you ever pause between came and up, that's a big mistake, and up isn't even used as a preposition here. You also shouldn't be pausing before with. You should have a pause before to, because the trailing bit is an infinitive added to the core structure of the sentence. Here's another thing you should look out for when pausing for prepositions. Even if you choose to pause at a preposition, they tend to be even shorter than a short comma, sometimes to the point that it's too short for you to catch your breath. Now, the second question you might have about pausing is the fact that I didn't pause at every possible location. I just went over the topic that some pauses take precedence over others, so that's a part of it. There's another reason to that. You simply don't pause at every single possible location because it will break up the speech into too many pieces. If you take a look at my breakdown for this example, ignoring the mandatory pauses for punctuations, I only chop up the long pieces into two shorter ones that are manageable to read. You might be able to find 2 pauses in a very long stretch of text, but usually no more, because any more than that will make the flow of speech sound extremely unnatural. If, at any time during the test, you can't be sure if you should pause at a location, my best advice for this case would be don't. Remember that it is generally worse to pause at somewhere you shouldn't than not pause at somewhere you should. But the best way to overcome this difficulty is simply by having more practice. I would recommend printing out the passages and labeling where the pauses should be. This is very helpful to getting a feel for it, and this is the ultimate goal, for you to know where the pauses are without consciously referring to the rules because you don't have the time to go into deep analysis during the test. Another common question that students might have is about the speed. It usually worries them if they find themselves finishing the text either in about 20 seconds or close to or over 40. According to my experience, as long as you finish everything you want or have to say in the allocated time, you're fine. After all, there are native speakers who talk extremely slowly, so pace alone shouldn't be a punishable trait. Of course, if you struggle to finish within 40 seconds, that is quite an issue, but students tend to talk a lot faster when taking the test because they're nervous since they knew they didn't study as hard as they could. So I wouldn't worry too much if you go over the time limit just a little bit during practice. A good target for this type of question is finishing in around 30 seconds. Going too fast means it's more likely for you to make a mistake, and too slowly means either you risk not finishing in time or you might have a problem with pausing for too long. But do remember that everybody has a different natural pace, and if yours is well within the allowed time for answering this question, there's no big incentive for you to ever change that. I do recommend, however, that you slow down a little bit if the time permits, just to reduce the likelihood of skipping a sound or mispronouncing stuff. That's what I did when I took the test myself, even though I didn't have to, but you'd be surprised how significant this method is to many students that can lower their chance of making a mistake.
The problem is, I fear I have forgotten how I used to talk.
Well, if it's any consolation, this isn't any worse.
Now, let's talk about the cheeky strategies you can use to basically nullify any of the difficult words in the text. If there are words you find difficult to pronounce, you can simply switch it to something or something similar. This is a very prevalent method that agencies teach to their students, and as far as the results go, it seems to work quite well. We know very well that this will lead to scoring lower on content, but this was the original plan. We can situationally sacrifice content if it helps to improve pronunciation and fluency in return. A few things to look out for. Firstly, don't do it in practice. I mean, what's the point of practice then? You're just fooling yourself. Do remember that content is still worth a big chunk, so getting some of the difficult words right is still encouraged. The second point would be don't overdo it during the test. Repeating something 60 times for a question is just asking for the whole thing to be given a 0. You might be wondering, why not just skip the difficult words instead of swapping it with something? A good reason would be for fluency. Remember that fluency depends on the sentence structure, and if you just drop words from the passage willy-nilly, it means that you might accidentally omit an important structure of the sentence, which is definitely not ideal. It can also mess up the natural rhythm of speaking, so keep that in the back of your head. Let's wrap up everything before going into practice. You have 40 seconds to study a passage and then 40 seconds to read it out loud. You can go through the whole thing when preparing to help locate difficulties for pronunciation and pausing. You have the option of replacing some of the difficult words with a placeholder like something, which will count as an error for content but can be of great help for fluency and pronunciation. Whatever I go through today can be treated as a very good starting point for your practice, and the reason why I chose not to go into detail with the more sophisticated concepts is that they are generally not needed for most students, and even if they are, they will be very specific to the individual. Oftentimes, getting the basics right is enough for even getting a 79. Don't get me wrong, it is easier said than done, especially if you want to do it consistently, but with enough practice and strategy, speaking usually won't be the bottleneck to your target achievement. With all that in mind, here's what you would do for this particular question to get a perfect score. Feel free to read along with me. In fact, this can be a very good practice to see if there are certain words that we pronounce differently, and then think about why that might be. Do remember that the pace is not very important so long as you sound natural and can finish within the designated time. Once most animals reach adulthood, they stop growing. In contrast, even plants that are thousands of years old continue to grow new needles, add new wood, and produce cones and new flowers, almost as if parts of their bodies remain forever young. The secrets of plant growth are regions of tissue that can produce cells that later develop into specialized tissues. For this particular question, there shouldn't be too many words that you find difficult, at least in terms of pronunciation. The main difficulty should be the two long pieces of text, but that shouldn't be a problem either once you correctly determine the pausing locations. Do remember that pauses vary in lengths depending on the punctuation and context. Before I end this video, I would like to point out one critical aspect of Read Aloud. To many students, this is not a very difficult type of question.
The best!
So they often choose to neglect it during practice. That's only part of the full picture because Read Aloud serves another very important purpose.
I know!
This is something that we'll discuss at length when we get to describe image and retail lecture, but the main idea is that Read Aloud lays foundation for how you would approach the other speaking questions. That'll be all for this video, and next time we'll start discussing the next question type, repeat sentence. Please like, subscribe, and share if you find this helpful, and leave in the comments below any question you might have about PTE Academic. Do not drink bleach, and I'll see you all next time.